Larry, can you press into that biblical sort of narrative? Like, so we see in the book of Acts this explosion of the church a couple times. We see the 3,000 the day of Pentecost. We see just droves of people coming to Christ. So maybe in a comparative way, how was leadership what we read? Because a lot of times we read the book of Acts looking for leadership models or principles. A lot of pastors do. So maybe what can we extract from that as leaders, and how is that shifted, and how's that different now?
Yeah, well, what happens is I like to say we're all like fish in water. You ask a fish how's the water, it goes, what water? And because we don't realize it. And so we tend to read the book of Acts through the world experiences we have. We do it with the Gospels as well. One of my favorites that I talk about in Accidental Pharisees is Joseph of Arimathea. For almost every modern day pastor, he's just a conjunction between the key parts of the gospel story. The death, of course, he had to be buried and then raised again. But all four Gospels make a big deal out of Joseph of Arimathea because he was courageous and he was there when no one else was. But on top of that, they understood something we forget, that when you're crucified, you're not buried. You're thrown out on a garbage heap. Your body is eaten. So the fact that all the disciples who'd left everything to follow Jesus were not there, just Joseph, who had been a secret disciple because he was afraid of what he'd lose as a member of the Sanhedrin, suddenly boldly steps up. Man, they all go after that. We read it right over our heads. I think it's the same thing in the book of Acts. We see 3,000 coming to the Lord, and we see it in our framework of almost like a revival. Well, no, there were this massive crowd for the high holy days that were in Jerusalem. At that point, they're hanging around in for Pentecost, and what we call Pentecost takes place, and all kinds of people get saved. But it wasn't that large group gatherings like that were not the norm. They were a very unusual thing. That's why the 5,000 that Jesus feeds is, they mark that down as like, that's an amazing thing. So I think what we can learn from the book of Acts is principles. What happens is we take a book that most of us see as descriptive, and we pick and choose what parts we want to make prescriptive. And for instance, I've done it. Most teaching pastors have. We've taught we want a New Testament church, right? We say that. But whenever anybody says you want a New Testament church, I go, dude, have you read the New Testament?
Yeah.
That person's like jacked up. I want to be a church planner like Paul. Like, really? I mean, he planted such crappy churches, he had to write all those letters.
I've never considered that.
Yeah, or the church in Acts chapter 2 that we preach through. We pick and choose. Man, they were all into the apostles' teaching, and they were sharing together. They were breaking bread, and they were held in awe by all the people. And my charismatic friends point out, no, it says specifically because there were signs and wonders, not because they were good and had community service and missional ministry. They also met every single day. And perhaps the reason they shared what they had and sold all their properties was because they lived in a culture in which there were no banks. There was no Western Union. There were no credit cards. They all thought Jesus was returning right away. They were in Jerusalem in a highly hospitable culture. I'm married to a Armenian gal, so Middle Eastern, where I understand the priority of hospitality there. And in that culture, you just take care of the people. And he's coming back, like, why not sell your stuff? No one seems to notice later on there was an offering taken for the poor saints in Jerusalem. Or that they were completely disobedient to the Great Commission. They stayed in their holy huddle until persecution is said in Acts chapter 8. And God has to kick them out. And by the way, sometimes if I'm talking to a room full of people, I like to ask how many are Gentiles. Because I point out they really didn't want any of you in their church. So that's the kind of church you want to be. The book of Acts is not a prescription of how to do ministry. It's a description of the work of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Yeah.
And what took 30 years, we read in 30 minutes and takes overnight. And what the miracles we see, we think should be like everyday experiences, which of course we call that an everyday experience, not a miracle. What makes it a miracle is how rare it is. So, like, one more piece on this would be, we often look to the book of Acts to figure out how to organize our churches, right?
Yeah.
And so we have our elders, and we forget they were house churches. And by the way, to give a context, I'm a Bible guy, unapologetic Bible guy. I got a Bible verse for everything, even if it's out of context. So it's like that's where I am. And so I see the errors sometimes of my tribe and my way. And so what we'll do is we'll see elders, and then we'll try to have our church led by elders, which is fine. But we forget the elders that Timothy was appointing were house church elders, groups of 25, 15, 30, maybe 50 at the most. I don't know a lot about house churches, but I do know this: they don't have a governing board.
Right.
So, I'm taking a governing board, trying to read Acts into it. One last thing on that would be Acts 6, where we go back and try to figure out, do we have deacons in the New Testament way of table servers and right qualifications, etc. But I always tell people, no, the real lesson of Acts chapter 6 is when you start to drift from fulfilling the Great Commission, you can organize any way you want. Because the reason they did that was a battle taking place between the Hellenistic Jews, widows, and the Greek widows. So that kind of thing is going on. And now the apostles are not spending their time in the word and prayer. The Great Commission is being sidetracked for passing out checks to widows. So they create a new form. And I'm sure there was some little old lady there who said, I've read every word of Jesus in red. He never said anything about deacons. This is not biblical. She would have been right. Jesus didn't authorize elders, didn't authorize deacons, didn't authorize church councils. They were spirit-led solutions to getting realigned with the Great Commission. And so to me, when I look at the book of Acts, that's where I go with it. I go, what is it teaching me about the heart of God, not so much the methods of the first century?